Well, if the world's financial markets are about to topple and the whole capitalist system is about to implode, maybe Jeremy Corbyn will be the man to step in and save us. He has a distinct approach to economics. Corbynomics, it is being called. Needless to say, his ideas are coated in Marmite. He has devotees as well as his critics. He got some endorsement from a few dozen economists over the weekend, who wrote to The Observer not to support Mr Corbyn as such, but to argue his views are perfectly sensible and mainstream. But what does he actually want to do? Jeremy Corbyn does want to get the deficit down, but he doesn't want to do it with cuts to public services. Instead, he thinks the government might be able to close it with extra tax revenues. He's suggested there could be up to £120 billion to be found in a big crackdown on tax avoidance, evasion and collecting old tax debts. He thinks we should perhaps get rid of corporate welfare. He cites £93 billion of business tax reliefs, some of which could be used to create a national investment bank. More infrastructure could be financed with what he calls People's QE, the Bank of England printing money to help fund things like housing and better digital infrastructure. He also thinks things like the railways and the energy companies would be far better run by the state. And lastly, the mines. Mr Corbyn wants to reopen some of them, rather symbolically summing up an economic policy that seeks to undo many of the changes made since Mrs Thatcher's government. Your 1-minute guide to Corbynomics there. Well, here with me now are Anne Pettifor, economist, and Charles Clarke, a former Labour cabinet minister. And I don't know how much of a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn you are, but you're kind of, quite a bit behind him, I think.
Yes, I am.
What do you like about his programme?
What I like most about it is that he is changing the political narrative, that we're changing the conversation, the public conversation we're having about the economy, away from Osbornomics, which is that the way to deal with a financial crisis to punish those who are victims of it, not the architects of it, and towards a more sustainable economy, which says, you know, most of the British public were not responsible for this crisis. They should not be punished for it. We should have a different approach towards the deficit. We should use the deficit as an opportunity for public investment on some really important things, like, for example, expanding broadband. This is incredibly sensible. And the fact that our government won't do this is really rather worrying.
Can we focus on some details? Because we were looking through his document and his speech today, and he quotes this figure of £120 billion of potential uncollected tax revenues.
Yeah.
Is that, and I've seen people agree with that. Do you think we can get much of that?
There's an awful lot of dodging going on out there. I was just looking at Anglian Water, for example. It made a profit this year of about £160 million, paid no tax at all.
So how much of the £120 billion do you think we can actually realistically collect? I mean, it obviously includes some tax not paid by bankrupt companies who are not like Anglian Water.
No, exactly.
And aren't going to pay. So of £120 billion, which he quoted,
yeah,
how much do you think we'll actually be able to get?
I think it's very easy to raise 120 billion, and the way to do that is to tax those people who are dodging taxes, while the rest of us are bound to pay because of PAYE. But the most effective way of raising tax revenues is by increasing employment, getting more people into work.
But of the 120 billion he cites of uncollected revenues, what proportion can we actually get? I mean, it's a figure he's bandied around. I mean, he says, you know, that's enough to double the NHS budget, as though he's going to be able to do that using this money. I don't know.
Evan, you have to understand that actually we are a low tax avoidance economy. We are effectively a.
But he might be giving the impression that he doesn't have to raise taxes. He can just grab this money from people who aren't paying it.
To be honest, I'm just wondering,
does anybody serious think there's 120 billion out there?
Yes, I seriously think so. I think that if we employed all those millions of young people who are sitting at home, not doing enough, and who are talented and educated, if they were in work and paying taxes, we'd be able to raise that kind of money.
Let me raise another one, because there was some discussion this morning on the radio about whether the Bank of England at the moment is in any way independent or just receives instructions from the Treasury.
Right.
Which is your view?
Well, my view is, I've worked in Nigeria and in Africa, that it's really important for the Bank of England, for any central bank, to be independent of political interference. At the same time, this is the government's bank. It's a nationalised bank. It was nationalised in 1945 because of its incompetence in handling the financial crisis of the 20s and 30s. And it is there to support both the public and the private sectors. I don't see it as being, you know, Mr. Cameron talks about being a monetary radical and a fiscal conservative. I think that is an insane boast.
But hang on.
And explains why our economy has taken so long to
So you
recover.
can't be in favour of people's QE then, because that would be instructing the bank to
I'm in
print
favour
money.
of having a conversation about the fact that QE has benefited the few, as the Bank of England itself has said, the 5% who own 40% of those assets that were exchanged by the Bank of England and who were enriched by that. And I think by calling it people's QE, you're exposing the fact that, that QE was not for the people, it was for the few.
Charles Clarke, what do you make of the economic debate?
I think the core is what you did, Evan, at the beginning of this programme about China. What that whole crisis has demonstrated is that confidence in the government, in this case of China, is absolutely essential. If the world markets start to lose confidence in their economic institutions and about the stability and strength of the economy, then there are a whole set of very serious consequences that follow. And I think Jeremy Corbyn, who's put forward the people's QE, which you've just mentioned, the idea of ending the independence of the central bank, his key advisor said, nationalisation without compensation, apparently, of a number of our key areas. Those are precisely the kinds of measures which will weaken confidence in any British government and in so doing increase inflation, interest rates, reduce employment and so on.
And can I say, he hasn't called for, he's actually been very measured in these policies. He hasn't called for nationalisation, he's called for public control. And you can have public control with a minority control in it. And you can also have it by effective regulation of some of these public utilities, which are, by the way, phony markets. They're not real.
Charles.
These markets had to be created in order to transfer public assets to the private sector.
I read very carefully what his advisors have been saying, what Jeremy himself has written, what John MacDonald has written, what Mr. Murphy, his economic advisor, have written. And they've all been clear that they're talking about renationalising, not the various other measures that you've talked about, the Royal Bank of Scotland, renationalising the railways, looking at the utilities and so on.
Yeah, but doing it in a measured way, Charles, not just by...
Charles Clarke,
can I
just push you, Charles? Do you agree with something that Jeremy Corbyn says, which is that Labour shouldn't be swallowing the story that austerity is anything other than a new facade for the same Tory plan? I mean, essentially, they're cutting the state to 35% or 36% of GDP, way beyond what you need to balance the books. You could just put taxes up.
I almost agree with what Jeremy says there, and I also agree that we lost the argument, quite wrongly, after 2008, that the Labour government was somehow responsible for
the argument. We didn't lose it. We gave it away.
I certainly agree with that, and I think Jeremy is right to say that. And there are other things that Jeremy says which I think is right.
More infrastructure spending, very mainstream.
A strategic state he talks about. Possibly a national investment bank. These are things I'm certainly not opposed to. You've got to see how you do it.
More agreement than you might have expected.
But the core issue is the one I said right at the beginning. Would the country itself have the confidence to vote Labour, and would the world economy have the confidence to sustain a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership with the kinds of policies he's putting forward?
That's always been the blackmail aimed at reform of the financial system. That was the blackmail that assailed the Labour government in 1929-31. Ramsay MacDonald. He was told, you know, that you'll break the system if you don't accede to the demands of the merchant bankers. And so he did, and what happened was we had this enormous crisis which followed, and it took, if you like, Keynesian policies to pull back the economy.
1931, 1948 devaluation, 1967 devaluation, 1974 IMF, 1979 winter of discontent.
These were all liberalisation policies. They're all based on liberalisation of the global economy.
I'm going to draw a halt to that because I do want to talk a little about the politics. Because Charles, who are you backing in the contest? I don't think
I voted 1 Kendall, 2 Cooper, 3 Burnham.
Right, and 4 Corbyn.
I didn't actually use my 4th vote. I didn't feel it was particularly helpful.
You've just written a book on Labour leaders. And how are you rating the ones you voted for against the, if you like, the standards of those of leaders past?
In the book, we set a number of criteria. For example, is there a coherent electoral strategy? Can they manage the party effectively? Are they governing with the spirit of the time? Do people have confidence in their ability to govern? And I did a little grid of those people and rated them. And I had Burnham, Cooper and Kendall about the same, some variations, and Corbyn a very long way behind.
And where were they in relation to previous leaders, though? Cooper and Kendall and Burnham?
I would say they're worse than some previous leaders we've had. I mean, the big successful leaders, people like Attlee, were very successful in these areas.
Yeah, and they were successful precisely because they challenged globalisation and liberalisation.
I'm just interested in how you rate the handling of the contest. You went through a litany of failures under Labour governments, I suppose you might call them. I just wonder how you think they've handled the contest itself.
I think it's been a disaster, unfortunately. I think I'm very sad about it. I wrote about it immediately after the election. It was very important to get through to have a process where people had confidence in the election process. We've got legal challenges. I think there may still be further legal challenges about the process. Issues about who can vote, who can't vote. Many party members who've been active for years distressed to see people who've been campaigning against the party with an equal vote to them in these circumstances.
And
I think we've made a series of mistakes.
Who is to blame for this?
The leadership.
Well,
The political leadership, the political class at Westminster.
Well, you're blaming the whole political class for the
No, I'm blaming
fiasco of
the
election.
Labour leadership,
Well, I agree
which
with
has
that.
not
You agree
given
with that?
voice
Harriet
to...
Harman.
I think
is
the
to
National
blame.
Executive Committee, the leadership sheet that Anne's talking about, I don't think Harriet's done it very well. I think the changes Ed Miliband brought in were a mistake, and many people argued that at the time, and there'd been a series of mistakes of this kind. What I worry about is that we really have to summon ourselves up and say, OK, how are we going to move out of this to a situation where Labour can regain the confidence of people in the country? I don't think that Jeremy will be able to do that. I do think the three others have got a chance of being able to do that, and that's the issue that we'll have to move to.
Leave it there. Anne, Charles, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I've been